Devils Productions presents The Great Deep.
So joining us on the Great Deep podcast is Naomi Holdt. Naomi, thank you so much for joining us. I think when people listen to this, they're not going to be aware of the time difference between us. So we're 6 hours apart. So you have woken up very early on a school morning in order to meet and chat with me, and I really appreciate it. So welcome to the podcast.
Oh, it's awesome. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
So for those who don't know about you, could you give us just a brief summary, like where you're from, what you do, where your interests are, et cetera, et cetera?
So I am an educational psychologist and I'm in private practice in KZN, Pietermaritzburg and Hilton. But I'm absolutely passionate about parenting, everything related to kids, to teens. So I do a lot of speaking. And yeah, this is just where my heart lies in this kind of stuff. So that's me in a nutshell. I have two beautiful kids, Christian and Rachel, 7 and 9 years old. And yeah, love the parenting journey. It's jolly hard some days, but that's I think why I also love working with parents so much, is just because we're all in the same boat. We're all in this like messy journey of parenting and life together, but there's so much beauty in between it all, and that's what I think it's important for us to kind of refocus and find those moments too, and work out how to stumble best along it.
Absolutely. I think that's the perfect segue into why I wanted to talk to you, because anyone who follows the Great Deep, follows my music, knows that that's kind of integral to the songs and also to all the art and stuff that I do, is that, you know, family is important, and children have a lot to teach us adults, right?
So much. Oh my goodness. Like, I don't actually think we know half of ourselves before we have kids, and you think you've like got it figured, and then you have children, and I mean, they have this amazing way of actually showing us exactly what we need to work on. And I think it makes it so hard, but also I think we've also got to relook at, wow, because my child is showing me what I need to work on within myself, they're actually helping me grow as a human. And every day my kids are like, the things that they teach me just cause me almost gobsmacked with the lessons that I'm learning from these two beautiful kids of mine, and all the kids and teens that I work with too. I honestly think they are amazing beings.
Oh, they really are. So, Naomi, if you could narrow it down, as an educational psychologist, what would you say is the single greatest problem that you deal with most in parent-child relationships?
When I saw that was along the lines of what you were going to be asking, I was like, wow, Ryan, there's so many. Especially in today's kind of day and age, you know, when we're talking about the parent-child relationship, I think it's really, though, that teens, one of the factors is they don't feel understood. They don't feel like adults get them. That's the one thing. And very often parents will come in and there's like this them and us mentality. So the child is seen as the problem with whatever they're presenting as. And I kind of like to think of the visual as there's a fence, the child is on the one side, the parenting is on the one side, the other side. And we've got to change that dynamic completely. We've got to see the child as with us, alongside us, and there's something in the relationship that we need to work on. So that's so often, because of course then when the child becomes the problem, you see all sorts of kickoff issues from that, because a child who feels like they're the problem will behave in a certain way. Their self-esteem will be impacted on. No child who feels bad about themselves can ever behave in any other way. And that's, I think, something that when I say this to parents, it's often like it's really, when I say these words, they hit me straight in center. But that our children can only be who we see them to be. So they see themselves through our eyes. So it's so important that, again, going back to our own journey, like we've got to be working on ourselves and how we see them. And so often how we see them is actually our stuff. It's got nothing to do with them. So that very much, I think the big thing is that us and them, instead of this recognition, and I often have to, and this thought comforts me on those really messy days when parenting has felt like, oh my word, I've stuffed up, it's just been a disaster, is to think of like life with our kids as a dance. It's backwards, it's forwards. It's not meant to be. I don't know if when we have kids, we think we might have it figured out. It's meant to be a certain way because we see what we think what's happening on social media, how perfect everyone else seems to be managing this. There's these expectations we put on ourselves, and it's all a load of rubbish. Like relationships are messy. We know our relationships with our spouses. I mean, they are not hassle-free. So why on earth, when we're under one roof, we're all different human beings, but we kind of think it must go smoothly? No, it's this beautiful, messy dance, and some days it's going to be disastrous, and that's also okay. The other thing that I think we do as adults is we have these adult expectations of our kids, and we forget, which is why it's so important that we understand where kids are developmentally, even from a neurological perspective, because our brains, human brains, are developing until the mid-20s, and we forget that. So we expect our kids to be organized, remember to pick up their stuff, like remember to do the 5 things that we ask them, and then they don't. Not because they are being naughty or disobedient or disrespectful, but because they are being kids or being teens, or they're being appropriately exactly where they need to be. But then we lose it with them, and that causes a disconnection in the relationship. So that's why I think like such an important part of parenting is actually just understanding where our kids are at. Because if we can understand where they're at developmentally, we also know where they struggle. And of course, reframing things from my child is driving me mad and giving me such a hard time to, oh, wow, my kid's really battling with this. Let me help. Or, oh, my goodness, Naomi, that was like so unrealistic of you to expect them to actually do. That also really helps. So I think those are kind of, if we really look at that, plus the last thing I want to mention, as I said, I mean, there's so many, we could probably talk all day about this. And I'm so passionate about talking all about these kind of things, but probably one of the biggest things that is an issue between parent-child relationships of all ages is actually parents who don't look in the mirror. And for me, that is one of the most important parts of parenting, is the ability to every day haul out that parenting mirror, take a look at yourself and go, okay, what do I need to work on here? Because what happens is, when that little baby is born and we're holding them in our arms, so often we'll either, whether we consciously or unconsciously, we look at that little person and we're like, I will raise you differently. I will do things differently here. But as life goes on, like we've been wired a certain way. Parenting is all about role modeling. So we've learned how to parent from the only textbooks that we had, which is our parents. So unless we actively kind of acknowledging and working on ourselves all the time, we're going to keep falling back into our wiring of maybe parenting how we were parented. And we know that so much has changed from what we know from a research perspective about what our kids need and how they should be being parented. And what, those traditional, I don't know how you were parented, Ryan, but we were like the wrath of God kind of parenting. And we know now, and so many people were, like that is, you're looking at how to grow a brain and how to raise a child. Well, you're going to keep them in fear and completely hinder and stunt their development and create the likelihood for anxiety and depression if you parent like that. So we got to haul out that mirror and go, okay, whoa, what is my default been? And what are my triggers here? And what do I need to change? So yeah, that's in a nutshell.
It's a fascinating world we find ourselves in now, with the research that is, just so readily available, that we can kind of reflect on, as you say, like how we were parented, and then also like look in the mirror, and it's really a bit of a mind bender. I must be honest. I find it like, well, this is actually just too much. I need a nap right now.
And it can feel like that, but I think that's also what we have to, it's actually, yes, we can think, oh my word, like this is all just too much. But at the core of it, I mean, for me, it's so exciting because we're not just doing things because of the way they've always been done. Like, we know better. And let's be honest, like, it doesn't feel good to shout at your kids and of course we're human, we're all going to do that sometimes, but that kind of old traditional way of parenting, it leaves the kid feeling terrible about themselves, it leaves us feeling awful, and it leaves us disconnected from them. And healing and growing and any relationship building is connection. So if we can find ways to navigate, how do we get through this parenting thing with our primary aim as a strong connection, and be more embracing and accepting of our imperfections and our human mistakes, which gives our kids, of course, permission to be human and make those mistakes too. Well, it's that much easier. You see, when we set up, well, oh my word, like, I need to remember that they're this age and these are the expectations. Let's just take a breath. Like, humanly, we're imperfect, they're imperfect. We embrace one another on that journey. It makes it that much more likely that we're going to find so much more joy along the way. I mean, my kids just know I'm an absolute stuff up. So, I stuff up completely some days. And with those days that I do, and I say, oh my word, guys, like, I'm so sorry. They usually the last time that I had to apologize to my daughter, because we got to own our mistakes. Her words were, she threw her arms around. She said to me, Mom, it's okay. You're just human. And I thought, awesome, because she's got it. We can stuff up so they can stuff up. And that's our human journey. Whereas how we were raised was parents never said sorry and you have to be perfect. So there's high expectations. I mean, just saying that makes me anxious.
I also find, I don't know, you probably find this a lot, and I've heard you talk about it as well, but the lens through which children look at the world is so beautiful, which is kind of why, that was the song that we wanted to hinge this conversation on, A Colorful World, which is, when I look at how my kids enter into something new, it's just like, it's amazing. And to see it through their eyes is actually wonderful. If you can get there, if you can unravel all the, I have to be X, Y, and Z as a parent, and I've got to tick all these boxes, I've got to know all the answers and but embracing the moment with your kids, like, what advice would you give to parents in terms of that? Is there like a simple thing or some simple things that they can do to just see the world through their child's eyes?
I think it's so important. It's so hard. Let's just own it. Like, in the world that we live in, it is so hard to stop, to pause, and to be in the moment. But it is so absolutely important. And the first way that we do that is probably the hardest, and that is by our own stress and regulation. Like, what are we doing as parents to reduce our stress? Because when we're stressed, we're rushed. We literally, when I get a visual, I'm a very visual person. When I get the visual of just the world that we live in, I see myself and everything around me is blurry, because that's how fast we're going. But in those blurry moments, we are missing exactly what you've spoken about, like the awesomeness and the beauty. And it still never ceases to amaze me. Like, I'm always getting, Mom, come and look out. And I'm like, oh my word, what? And then there's it's like a moth, it's something, it's just the most, and when you pause and you can put your own stuff aside and that email aside and that message you have to answer aside in your head, and take a breath in the moment. And what I found, if you've got littler kids, actually get onto their level so you are seeing the exact picture that they're seeing from their perspective. And even if they're bigger than you, just stop and step into where they're at, and look at this thing. But to do that, we have to be able to put all else aside. So that, of course, means things like, how are we looking after ourselves? Are we taking that 10-minute walk in the garden? We underestimate self-care and the need to fill our own tanks in order to show up and be present for our kids and in their world as we need to. And then I think what's just because rush is, and it's been on my mind so much lately, it's just this whole concept of how rushed we are. And I think it's got to do with that this year has felt absolutely crazy, because I think we're trying to catch up for the few years that we, in an essence, missed. So it's been the fastest year yet, but it's meant the most rush. which sadly, I think has meant there's been so much more disconnection with our kids and less of these moments where we've allowed ourselves to stop. But probably one of the biggest things is that when our kids, if we think about it, and I mean, me as a parent, just because I've been working with kids, she's for like 33 years in different ways. But just because I've been doing that, it doesn't mean I don't need to remind myself of these things all the time and that they're not really hard to do, because I'm also that crazy busy working parent. But when our kid says, Mom, Dad, come look here, or they come to us with something, it's so easy to try and multitask, to keep going. What we actually have to train ourselves is this thing, it might seem little to me, but this is huge to my kid, and this matters to them. And by it mattering to me, I'm speaking volumes to them about how much they matter to me and their sense of self. So stop what you're doing, close your laptop, put down your phone, stop chopping that carrot, like whatever it has to be, go to them, make eye contact, or get down on the level, look at what they're looking at, and listen. But whether they're telling you about their day, or they're showing you the worm, or whether they're telling you, if it's your older child or teen, like about like the conflict they had with their friend, it matters to them. So in our adult worlds, these things might seem trivial, but when our child feels that their world like really matters and we are that interested and we can see it through their eyes, it's like, wow, my parent really cares. That must mean that I am worthwhile. That must mean that I am beautiful. My parent gets how awesome this water on the leaf is, or how terrible my day was because this happened. So I think we just need to I like to think in this rush, I think we need to fiercely fight for those pockets. We can't, and we don't expect these like long periods of time of just lounging around. Great if you can find those. But for most of us, that is just not a reality. So we've got to fight for those pockets, grab onto them, hold them, and in those pockets, like just be. If I think of 2 words, it's just be in that moment. And here's the hard part, with no expectations. We need to throw our adult expectations out to get into the world of our kids.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. Like, and be kind to yourself, I suppose, would be, because I think there is an element of that where you like, I've got to do this, and actually just like you say, like in the beginning, is like, it's okay. Be kind to yourself, be kind to your kids. Well, I've heard you talk about kindness a lot in social media posts and places that you've spoken. When it comes to that, like, how do you avoid reacting in anger to those moments when your child just pushes your buttons? And I mean, children know how to push our buttons, right?
Of course.
What can we do to stop? Is there anything we can do in those moments?
There's so much. But again, I mean, we're not going to get it right all the time. We're still going to be triggered. But I think the more aware we are, and what I always like to remind myself, maybe I remind everyone else as well, but remember, I'm reminding myself these things all the time too, that every time we get it right, it's like you're strengthening that brain wiring so that there's the greater likelihood of you getting it right the next time. But at the same time, as you said, kindness and compassion to self, we're going to have days we stuff up epically and get triggered. And that's also okay. As long as we're going back, we're apologizing, we're just owning our humanity to our kids. But in that moment, I think we've first got to understand, well, firstly, isn't it interesting, and I often say this to parents, like the days when you get triggered, sometimes you come home from work and you're like, I've had such a hard day, and now why is my child doing this today of all days? Well, they're doing that today because of your emotional state. You are in any case dysregulated, so you're that much more easily triggered. Plus, our kids are mirrors and sponges, like bottom 2 lines here. They absorb everything and then they reflect it the only way they know how, because their brains, they're not at the point where they can sit down and process it and say, Mom, Dad, you've had such a hard day. Like, would you like a cup of tea and like to chat about it? That's just not going to happen. So they're going to suck it up and their behavior is going to reflect what's going on within us. So usually the first step when my kids are driving me crazy, I'm like, right, do a little, I call it the wand, that airport wand that you go, I know there's another name for it too, you go through and then it bleeps up and down if you've got anything metal on your, well, you haul out that wand, you do a quick little scan, and you're like, okay, what is going on within me? First step that could actually be exacerbating my child's sense of self. Because automatically, when we can do that, and when I know I can, so I know my work stress is a huge trigger. Just me being able to identify for a split second, okay, hang on, you've had a hard day. Immediately, I'm less reactive because I know it's not my child's stuff, it's my stuff. But let's say they are having a hard time and they are pushing your buttons. I think neon flashing light in front of us, like, my child is not giving me a hard time, my child is having a hard time. This is not personal. Okay, flash, flash, flash. Also remembering that, and this is a hard one, that the things that we've been triggered on are usually signs of things within us as parents that we need to work on. Okay, so it's like one of those, oh my goodness, yes, you're right. So sometimes it's like good to just actually note those things down. What do I need to work on? But going back to, okay, so the flashing signs, this is not personal, because when we take something personal, we also kind of fly into that reactive zone, and it becomes a defensiveness and a dysregulation. And then we're dysregulated, and two dysregulated brains are never, ever, I think it's like two cobras fighting. You're only ever going to end up with a bloodbath. There's no ways. So we know that to help a dysregulated brain calm down, we need to be in a regulated state. We can't regulate unless we understand it is not personal. So the other way is just to reframe anger. Like, when any human being is showing anger, actually anger is just defense against vulnerability. At the core of anger is always disempowerment. This isn't my child like pushing me away and intentionally being nasty. This is my child who is feeling so vulnerable. What does my child need? And going back to what you said about kindness, I think when we're like in a situation and we're like, I have no idea what to do right now, we've just got to, okay, what is the kindest thing I could do for my child right now? So the other way to like reframe all these like anger pushing boundaries is I like to use the porcupine mentality, I call it. Like, that porcupine, our kids, they're going to wake up in the morning and go, who am I going to like poke these quills into? And then go and find like a warthog or whatever. You know, the only time they're poking those quills is when they're feeling threatened, when something is sticking its head down their hole. So our kids are only going to eject those quills when they're feeling vulnerable and threatened. And when we can look at it like that, it's that much easier for us to slip into helper mode instead of defensive fighting mode. Okay, but now let's say everything has gone pear-shaped. We have been triggered. Of course, we do that wand, and then the quickest way to regulate ourselves, because if we don't do that, we've got zero chance of being able to actually help our kids, is actually to breathe. And we underestimate the power of breathing, because in those moments, let's be honest, like, no one wants to hang around and be near someone who's losing the plot. But our children our presence means that they're safe. So even though if you're really triggered, the best thing you can do is say something to them like, I'm going to be back in a moment. I'm just going to calm myself down and I'll be right back. And then step out and breathe. And I'll talk about the breathing now before you step back in. But if you can, just to stay in their space. In those times, you don't have to say anything. You don't actually have to do anything. But your presence is powerful in terms of it's speaking non-verbally that you can let it on. Bring it on. I am big enough to hold these emotions. I am not scared of your emotions. They're overwhelming to you right now, but I've got this. So bring it on. Emotions are normal. So we're giving them so much nonverbal information at these times. And whether it's you just sitting in the corner of a room, obviously if you're like out in the open, you want to take them to a smaller room, not because you're punishing them, but because it's kind of a containment, a physical and emotional more containment. And you sit with them. And they might not want you right next to them. Then you sit at the door in the corner and you regulate yourself. That is the best way. Remember, our children, because their brains are developing, the way that they learn regulation for themselves is through co-regulation. That has to happen, can only happen when they've got a regulated brain alongside them or in their presence. So breathing, as in not just like deep breathing, but actually things like focusing on 2 breaths in and then longer out, 4 breaths out through the mouth, like put some stuff on Facebook at the moment. Actually, I'm busy putting a few videos on after requests, just breathing techniques that help regulate us, because, you know, research has shown in terms of stress, when our stress hormones are like kicked out and flooding our systems, the fastest way to bring us back to homeostasis is breathing. So when you are feeling activated and feeling triggered, and you know that actually you need to show up and be there for your kid, for their needs, remember, in that moment of their dysregulation, we are like the containers. That's what they need us for, to contain their overwhelming emotions. Then we breathe, and you focus on those mantras like, I'm not a bad parent, I'm a good parent. Some days I have a hard day. My child is not a bad child. They're a good kid. They're having a really hard time. And this is not personal. That for me is like flash, like I literally picture the neon sign flashing.
Yeah.
And because it'll end. That's the other thing. You can think, oh my word, it will end. It will end. So you hold on. And when that storm ends, what is important is that your child can go, wow, I had a parent who could handle it. They could handle me. Otherwise, it's like they perceive rejection. The emotions are too big for us. They are not okay for us. And we never, ever want them to feel that way.
Now, that kind of thinking flies in the face of timeouts, right? So I don't know for how long, in education and in parenting, I've heard, no, just like, you know, if you lose it, if your child is losing it, timeout. Yeah, go sit in the other room until you can breathe, and then we'll talk. You know, and it also gives the parent the opportunity to calm down. But what you're saying is that it's like completely opposite to that. So actually be present in the, you know, in that space when it's all going down, but you yourself have to be grounded. So my question then is, do timeouts work, or are they a farce?
No, timeouts do. And I admit, and I say this because as parents, the more we know, the better we can do. And, you know, when my little girl was 2, I remember, I think I started like suddenly realizing, whoa, hang on a second, this way is just not working. But I remember I used to send her to timeout, and she used to know, she just used to take herself off to timeout. And now I'm like, absolutely not. Because now, again, what we know about the brain and how the brain develops and our children's needs and how we help them regulate. And my little one is a very emotional child. She's a highly sensitive child. So, you know, the emotions are extreme. When there's like a meltdown, it is a proper meltdown. But it has been amazing to see how what I just described last time in terms of us being in the space and holding those emotions, how that has literally, I cannot tell you how much it's helped. But what timeouts do is they're non-verbally saying, you shouldn't be feeling, your behavior is not acceptable, your big emotional space right now is not acceptable to me, and I can't deal with it. You need to, and actually what we're expecting in times that we're expecting our children to regulate themselves. That's why we do it. We like go and calm down, and then we can we know the brain cannot do that. Yes, they might eventually like literally nothing, like, you know, what's developing then is a child who kind of believes my emotions are too big. My parents can't handle this. And the likelihood for something at a later stage, like anxiety and depression. And again, we are feeding them the information from the youngest age that emotions are not acceptable in this home. Now, I think about the kids, the older kids and the teens that I deal with who are anxious, who are depressed. So many of them have been raised in homes where emotions weren't spoken about or they were punished. I mean, when I was growing up, emotions were punished. And unfortunately, so many of the kids and teens, emotions just are not spoken. They're dismissed, they're ignored because they're too overwhelming. Emotions can make many of us feel vulnerable as adults because we can't control them, and we shouldn't want to. But when we can understand that what our kids need in that moment to learn to regulate, again, is us being in a regulated state, staying there with them, then we understand you want to grow the brain. And isn't that our aim as parents? If we think about it's actually to grow our children's brain. It's to help them on that journey of brain growth. Well, we're not doing them any favors by sending them away. So time out, no. Time in, yes. Even if time in means you sitting in the corner of the bedroom. Time in.
That's amazing. Naomi, I want to touch on grandparents for a minute, because in my world and my work, it's been one of those things that I've really I've noticed the difference, and I remember my boss when I was a journalist. When we found out that we were going to have our first baby, I said, well, I'm open to any parenting advice that you are willing to give me. And he sort of leaned back in his chair like an old sage and said, grandparents. And I said, I beg your pardon? And he said, no, if you've got a good relationship with your folks, the benefits of grandparents extend way beyond babysitting. So my question to you would be, what role do grandparents play in the lives of children, and what role do those grandparents play in the lives of their own children? So there's like, if you understand the question, that there's sort of three tiers going on there.
I think it's such a huge topic, and there are of course so many sides to it, because yes, the side that you talked about, which is the positive, and there's so much value, and grandparents are incredible impact, have an incredible impact. And in terms of just the positives, we know that children's resilience is increased so much when they have a sense of belonging and a sense of self, and a sense of self that extends beyond my immediate family. So there was a way before me. There's a history here. And grandparents, I think and I've had so many, even of the kids that I've worked with, they're like, oh, and my granddad used to tell these stories. So there's this richness in who I am. I didn't just begin like when I was born. There's this whole history here, that where I come from. And for me, we live in a world, and one of the big problems is that kids don't have roots. They don't have a sense of real belonging. And of course, in our rushed lives as parents, sometimes it's hard. It becomes harder for us to give them that. And that's where I think grandparents, so yes, that sense of kind of, there's a history here. There was a before me. There will be an after me. I'm like a part of something bigger than me. How awesome. I mean, that just gives me goosebumps talking about it. And then, of course, just to know, our kids can never have enough people that they feel love them, that they feel fully accepting of them. And kind of for a lot of our kids, grandparents are the safe space where you're not going to get into trouble for everything. They'll probably pick up your shirt if you leave it on the floor. Like, you get that extra cookie. Like, it's the safe, happy space where you can just share with adults who really care about you. And our kids can never have enough of that. I mean, I know, in my life, there's only one set of grandparents, my husband's parents, and I can see the difference, and I feel that loss for my kids. So if you've got parents in your life and grandparents to your kids, like, awesome, because the more the better. Of course, the flip side to that, and we'll just to actually stay on that, the practical support for parents nowadays in terms of reducing stress. And of course, the more our parenting stress is reduced, the better our own relationships with our children. But we've seen that shift as well from decades ago, where now grandparents are so much more involved in picking kids up from school, getting them to swimming, because parents are so busy. So in that sense, grandparents are like the added glue that really helps keep families functioning, keeps family units close together, and more connected and less kind of all over the place. Because without grandparents, and those of us that don't have grandparents on hand all the time, it's parenting is, when you can't fetch your child, it's like, well, what are we going to do? So from a practical point of view, I think grandparents are so important, but that emotional sense of bigness and connection and history and rootedness and warmth and love, all of that, so important. And of course, then to the parents as well. But there's also, and I often say that unfortunately there's the flip side as well, where so many people have toxic relationships with their parents, and adults have toxic relationships with their parents. And, as parents, what we need to remember is no matter how old our children are, the parent-child relationship is always up to us. And so I think and that for our kids growing up is so important to remember. And I see so many adults in therapy who are so filled with grief because of the relationship that they have with their parents that isn't what they would like. And they take so much guilt for that, so much ownership. But it's up to us as parents, no matter our age, to always ensure a good relationship with our children.
I'm amazed at, and I know you've got a busy day ahead of you. I'm amazed at how the research has just it seems to me anyway, it seems to have accelerated in the last 10, 20 years in terms of, how we parent and what we know also developmentally about ourselves and about children and teenagers. But it's fascinating hearing you just enlighten and put a spotlight on some of those things. I really, really appreciate your time, Naomi. So thank you very much. And where can people get a hold of you if they want to chat more about anything that you've spoken about?
They can email info@naomiholdt.com, or then also just pop onto my website, which is naomiholdt.com, and you'll get some contact details there, or Facebook, Naomi Holdt, psychologist and speaker, or Instagram, Naomi Holdt, psychologist. But thank you for having me. It's been awesome. As I could talk all day about these kind of things. There was so much more to say.
We could go forever, you and I. But really appreciate your time, Naomi. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ryan. Cheers.